Superior Court of California, County of Los Angeles, in the matter of the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, case number BA097211. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in count 1 of the information.
On October 3rd, 1995, after months of deliberation and witness testimony, on that day a jury decided that OJ Simpson would be acquitted of a double murder that had occurred more than a year prior. Many were sure he was guilty, and seemingly the evidence pointed in his direction. So, how was this verdict reached? If the evidence was so solid, how was he found not guilty? The answer? Everything went wrong. June 12, 1994 was a date that would forever live not in fame but in infamy and abject failure, and would forever change the scope of forensics and murder investigations. Around 10:30 on the night of June 12, 1994, Stephen Schwab was out taking his dog for a walk in his rather friendly LA neighborhood. A few minutes before 11 p.m., Schwab encountered a white Akita that was barking incessantly. Unbeknownst to him, the Akita had been barking since about 10:15 p.m. that night. The white dog followed him home, and Stephen put his own dog inside his house. But when Stephen tried to take the Akita for a walk to locate its owner, the dog resisted. A neighbor of Stephen, Subaru Bostep, soon noticed that the dog had blood on its paws and legs, a concerning sight. About an hour later, Subaru and his wife took the dog for a walk and were led straight to the body of Nicole Brown Simpson, surrounded by a large pool of blood, just after midnight on June 13th. Officers arrived at the scene of 875 South Bundy Drive just minutes later and discovered there was not one body, but two. The second belonged to Ron Goldman, a friend of Nicole's. Both had been stabbed multiple times to death, all while Nicole's two young children slept soundly in their beds. Shortly after 2 a.m. on June 13th, Detectives Furman and Roberts appeared at the scene, with Detectives Lange and Banneter assigned as the lead investigators. Bloody shoe prints led away from the bodies and toward the back of the property, and a dark blue cap and a blood-soaked left-handed leather glove were the only suspicious items that appeared near the bodies. Detectives attempted to get in contact with Simpson in person by driving to his house, but no one had answered, and Simpson's white Ford Bronco sat nearby on the street, with a suspicious spot near the door handle. When detectives did manage to get in contact with OJ, who was now in Chicago having taken a plane there late the previous night, he was concerned. But he never asked for details, and despite having multiple ex-wives, he did not press for information on which one was dead. Then, at Simpson's house, another bloody leather glove, a right-handed one, was discovered. Detective Furman had climbed over a wall at Simpson's house earlier that morning, but the reason behind that climb was questioned in large part due to the lack of evidence. According to detectives, no one had answered the front door, and law enforcement needed to determine if anyone else's life was in danger. But, according to the defense attorneys later on, the property had no right to be searched for evidence because there was no warrant to allow a search. What's more, the defense suggested that Furman planted the glove at Simpson's estate himself, having been widely known for being racist, meaning his entire involvement in the case could put the entire processing of the crime scene in jeopardy. And that in actuality, both gloves originated from Nicole's home. But because there is no proof that either claim is unequivocally true, we will never know. This was mistake number 1. Detective Banneter claims to have observed drops of blood in the driveway of Simpson's estate, which led him to the white Bronco. Upon further examination, there was more blood inside the driver's side door and the center console, and more droplets led towards the front of the house. All photographs were taken, evidence was collected, the Bronco was impounded, and law enforcement had an arrest warrant prepared for Simpson. Once Simpson was apprehended, he was fingerprinted, injuries on his left hand were noted and photographed, and he was brought in for interrogation. Remember that blood that Detective Banneter found in the Bronco then leading up to the house? The nurse who drew blood from OJ reportedly took 8 ounces of blood for testing. But by the time it reached the lab, only 6 to 6.5 ounces could be accounted for. 1.5 to 2 ounces were missing, and the defense would claim that this was used to plant the evidence. This compounds on top of the fact that the actual amount taken from OJ was never truly documented, and therefore lack of documentation can never be proven or disproven. By itself, it could be reasoned that perhaps the nurse had miscounted. However, there's another piece of information that raises a lot of red flags. Banneter had taken the supposedly 8-ounce blood sample at the police station, supposedly sealed this in an evidence bag, and drove all the way over to Simpson's estate to transfer to Dennis Fung, who was the evidence collector for the case. This was to finalize the chain of custody and get placed with the rest of the evidence. But there was a multi-hour gap between the collection of the blood and the handoff of the evidence to the evidence collector. This was mistake number 2. As investigators and forensic technicians processed the scene, it was confirmed that some were not wearing personal protective equipment, or PPE. For forensic investigations, this often includes wearing booties, special suits, and lab gloves. This was mistake number 3. Detective Lang asked evidence collector Dennis Fung to collect a blood sample from a rear gate of the Bundy home. But according to evidence tags, this did not occur until July 3rd. That's over 3 weeks after the crime scene had first been serviced and after the scene had been released. Samples that are not collected immediately are at risk for contamination in a variety of forms. This can be the case even mere hours after a crime has occurred, and especially weeks or months after it occurred. The sooner perishable evidence is collected, the more viable it can be. And the fact that this was not collected immediately meant that this became mistake number 4. As onlookers began to gather, and after the assumed necessary photographs were taken of the victims, technicians brought out blankets from inside the Bundy residence to cover both Nicole and Ron's bodies. This was mistake number 5. The bodies of the victims had not been processed, and while photographs were taken, evidence was not collected yet. As the bedsheets came from inside the home, the risk of cross-contamination was raised exponentially, and potentially vital clues and data could have been missed through this simple action of covering the victims to dissuade onlookers. Not only that, but according to some sources, the onlookers and passerby were not directed away or crowd controlled. Crowd controlling protects crime scenes from potential contamination, and it also provides safety to the people inside examining the crime scene. There's also another reason for crowd controlling that most people would not even consider. Without crowd control, a crime scene can get a lot of widespread attention to the point where the media becomes so oversaturated with information, whether false or true, that defense attorneys can argue such coverage can prevent individuals from getting a fair trial, since everybody would know about it without crowd or information control. This can put attorneys at risk of losing their cases, especially from prosecution perspectives, meaning that this is mistake number 6. Evidence obtained from both Nicole and Simpson's properties revealed a number of commonalities. Both gloves, the one from Nicole's house and the other one from Simpson's house, connected Nicole and Ron and Akita. Socks from Simpson's house connected blood evidence to Simpson and Nicole. Evidence from Ron's shirt was consistent with hairs from Simpson, Nicole, and Akita, as well as varying fibers from the gloves, the blue cap, and Nicole's dress. There were many other connections as well regarding evidence, but these were considered some of the most prominent. Blood evidence from varying parts inside the Bronco was found to match Simpson, Nicole, and Ron in differing amounts. Although the timeline of the night of June 12, 1994 was never made public by law enforcement, given the relatively consistent timestamps provided by countless witnesses and investigators, Simpson was unable to give a clear response on his whereabouts at or around the time that the Akita started barking at approximately 10:15 p.m. However, this is where mistake number 7 comes into play. Some items were never logged into evidence properly, such as being put in the wrong types of containers. Example is that you don't put blood evidence into paper containers, as the moisture of the blood could soak into the paper and cause microbial growth that could ruin the entire sample. Some items did not enter the chain of custody properly, and it's hard to say exactly which items of evidence, such as each of Nicole's socks found at OJ's house, resulting in extensive cross-contamination to those as well. Self-contamination would also occur when, despite wearing gloves, some investigators would not change their gloves between handling different pieces of evidence. Photographs were taken extensively. However, there are also reports of many pieces of evidence having photographs with no clear scale provided on the image, which is standard practice. Some pieces of evidence, such as a dish with melting ice cream, which could have potentially helped to pinpoint the time of death, weren't even photographed at all. A witness during the trial also came forward confirming that security at LAPD and its labs were not substantial, and admitted that contamination is a regular occurrence. This was shown to be correct after more than one unauthorized individual was able to access the inside of the white Bronco while it was impounded. The lack of proper organization and a proper processing system essentially led the entirety of the crime scene to be considered contaminated, regardless of what had been done right up to that point. This is certainly fact because there were a number of expert witnesses on the prosecution side that made this claim. Nicole and Ron's bodies were autopsied in the coroner's office on June 14th, less than 2 days after the crime. Before autopsies could be performed, the blood on their bodies was rinsed off. This is mistake number 8 for a number of reasons. Some photographs had been collected of the bodies at the crime scene, but blood had not been collected off the deceased bodies, meaning that tests could not be run to further connect or disconnect the perpetrator from the crime scene. What's made worse is that the bodies of the victims were left in open air for hours, unexamined by any medical examiner until later in the day of June 13th, almost 12 hours after the bodies had been initially discovered. And even with the autopsy performed, the coroner failed to analyze the stomach contents of the victims and potentially provide a more accurate time of death. OJ Simpson would stand trial for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman on January 24, 1995. After months of evidence presentation and testimony, and a mere 5 hours of deliberation, a verdict was returned. Not guilty. This meant the prosecution could not provide the burden of proof that OJ had committed the crime. In the span of 2 days alone, mistake after mistake was committed, for the current day and age. But back in the mid-90s, many procedures were not in effect as they are today. Mistake number 2 references the scrutinous blood collection of O.J. Simpson. In current times, Venator would have taken the blood immediately to an evidence locker in the police station itself, rather than drive it all the way to the evidence collector over an hour away, even if the evidence was sealed. And for extra context, evidence bag seals were a thing back then, and it was very easy to tell if an evidence bag had been opened or tampered with. Not only that, but there should have been strict documentation on the amount of blood taken, an error which falls on Venator and the blood collection nurse. But back then, procedures behind chain of custody were not as well established, which caused a major discrepancy with the ideas surrounding blood work and potential evidence planting. Mistake number 3 references the lack of any personal protective equipment while the crime scene was processed. This is a huge no-no in evidence collection and crime scene investigation, as failure to wear appropriate PPE can lead to self-contamination and cross-contamination of varying types of evidence and the crime scene as a whole. It can easily derail entire court cases if even one person does not wear the appropriate gear when processing a crime scene. But the OSHA guidelines pertaining to blood collection and bloodborne pathogens weren't established until 1992, OSHA 1910.1030. And even then, there was a lack of information regarding evidence collection. This section wouldn't be revised until early 2001, more than 6 years after the crime. The National Institute of Justice published an article on the necessary precautions for the preservation of evidence back in 1976, except that article is only 4 pages long. Many of the mistakes reference in some capacity the presence and identification of blood and DNA evidence. However, DNA evidence was still in its infancy back in 1994. DNA wasn't first introduced in the courts as admissible evidence until 1986, less than a decade before the double murder. And a DNA database, CODIS, wasn't even established in the US until 1994. Lack of extensive studies on DNA analysis by the time of the crime meant that while DNA tests were performed on many pieces of evidence, the results may not have been very reliable, whether evidence was contaminated or not. And because DNA analysis was still so new, the general public was unfamiliar with this type of information and process, and the prosecution as a result had a difficult time getting the jury to understand that stuff. In today's era, this kind of investigation was riddled with numerous errors. But back in 1994, the procedures followed could very well have been seen as somewhat normal. The lack of proper procedures and processes led to outcries for reform on crime scene investigation. Evidence collection mishaps, crime scene security, lack of proper chain of custody rules, suspicious characters from law enforcement, the unfamiliarity of forensics in general, and even biased opinions all contributed to the not guilty verdict handed by the jury on October 3, 1995. Laws and rules were created or revised to better identify evidence collection techniques and crime scene investigation. Crime scene dramas began to crop up in the 2000s in particular, bringing ordinary folks somewhat closer to an understanding of the world of forensics. Science has improved drastically in a variety of forensic-specific fields, namely in DNA, in fingerprinting, and evidence analysis. Oversight was improved and altered in many departments as well. Perhaps if said trial was performed today, the outcome would have been very different. But in 1994, the mistakes added up enough to convince the jury otherwise. In the end, we may never know what really happened because of these mistakes, and this investigation shook the world of forensics as we know it, and law enforcement and crime scene investigation. And it is now remembered as an important lesson in what not to do at a crime scene. What up guys, OtterPop here. Thank you for watching this video on the failures of forensics and law enforcement in the OJ Simpson case. This video took a lot of prep work and a lot of editing and whatnot, and it would mean the world to me if you were to give it a like, maybe even subscribe to my channel. I would like to make more videos like these. They just take a little bit of time to, put together. But in any case, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As usual, until the next video guys, check you laters.